House number 24. That afternoon, the drizzle began very early, the kind of rain so fine that, if you only looked through a glass window, you would think it gentle. But stand on the porch for just a few minutes, and the chill would seep through your collar, creeping into your hair, your eyelashes, the spaces between your fingers, making the whole city feel as if it were blanketed in a thin, mournful layer of gray water dust. Dung drove slowly down the small, tree-lined street, both hands resting on the steering wheel, occasionally leaning forward to peer outside, searching for the house numbers mounted on the rain-slicked brick pillar. This neighborhood wasn't far from the city center, nor was it remotely isolated, yet strangely, the deeper she drove, the more Dung felt she was leaving behind the chaotic pulse of life to step into a different realm of silence, a place where houses stood apart, separated by wide lawns, low fences, ancient trees, and that cold, polite inn. Difference typical of residential areas, where people lock their doors very early. The sickly yellow streetlights spilled onto the wet asphalt, bleeding into long, murky streaks like old oil, momentarily crushed by tires only to shatter again in the thin film of rainwater. On either side of the road, the bushes were shoved askew by the wind. The branches of pine and maple let water drip onto the pavement, creating disjointed, pattering sounds that echoed near and far, as if someone were following her car with incredibly light footsteps. Dung raised her eyes to the small plaque fixed to the brick pillar on the right. Number 24. She eased off the gas, turning the car into the yard. Tires ground against the wet gravel with a dry, crunching sound, a noise so agonizingly clear in the rainy afternoon that she suddenly felt as though she had just awakened something sleeping inside the house. House number 24 materialized beneath the canopy of a massive willow tree in the front yard. It wasn't grand, it wasn't new, nor was it entirely dilapidated, but it possessed a sunken, heavy aura that was terribly hard to name. The former owner had perhaps chosen dark bricks to give it an antique charm, but in the rain, that hue grew darker, almost bruised, making the walls look as if they had absorbed too much moisture and sorrow over the years. The willow tree in the front yard let its long branches drape down, the leaves utterly soaked. Every time the wind blew, they bowed low against the porch like the hair of a woman standing outside the door, her head lowered, peering inside. Behind the house, through the narrow gap between two walls, Dung could faintly see the silhouette of an ancient maple tree reaching impossibly high. Its trunk was pitch black, its massive branches spreading wide to embrace the back roof, seemingly protective, yet simultaneously pressing down, making the small house look vastly more desolate than the sun-drenched photograph Tan, the real estate agent, had shown her last week. Dung turned off the engine and looked at her watch. Just past 8. It would be nearly 15 minutes before Tan arrived. She leaned back against her seat, exhaling a breath that fogged the windshield. She shouldn't have arrived this early. She should have sat at the diner a little longer, slowly drinking her hot tea, waiting until the exact time to drive over. But for the past few days, an indescribable anxiety had been gnawing at her chest. This house, if it was truly as perfect as Tyne claimed, would solve so many things. Or at least, she desperately wanted to believe so. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lamb, had moved to America almost a year ago. The day she welcomed them, Dung had cried relentlessly at the airport. Mrs. Lamb hugged her daughter, laughing and crying all at once, while Mr. Lamb tried to maintain his composure, simply wiping his eyes with the back of his hand and saying, "Making it over here is a blessing, child." In the beginning, Dung and T letter 1B0 letter 1EDBCS house was full of voices. Mrs. Lamb cooked the Vietnamese dishes the kids loved. Mr. Lamb told stories from the homeland, and in the evenings, the whole family would sit together watching drama series. Kitchen always smelled of ginger, fried shallots, and the rich fish sauce of braised dishes. The joy of reunion, like so many beautiful things, begins to reveal its tiny fractures when left to sit too long in the reality of daily life. Dung's house wasn't terribly cramped, but adding 2 elderly people meant adding 2 different rhythms of life, 2 different sets of habits, 2 different kinds of silence. Mr. Lamb had been addicted to cigarettes since his days in Vietnam, a habit he hadn't managed to quit in America. He tried to smoke on the porch, in the yard, sometimes waking in the middle of the night to slip on a jacket and step outside for a drag, but the smell of smoke still followed his clothes into the living room, clinging to the curtains and the sofa. Mrs. Lamb, meticulous and clean, liked to organize the kitchen her own way. She liked to remind her children and grandchildren to eat, to tell T letter 1B0 letter 1EDBC not to stay up so late, to urge the kids to speak more Vietnamese. These things weren't wrong. They all stemmed from love. But the love of the elderly sometimes drapes over the lives of the young like a blanket that is far too thick. It's warm, yes, but over time, it makes it hard to breathe. T letter 1B0, letter 1EDBC, was not a bad man. He remained polite, still drove her parents to their doctor's appointments, still fixed the leaky faucets, changed the light bulbs, and handled their paperwork. But Dung noticed her husband smiling less. He worked later into the night, sat in front of his computer longer. Sometimes the screen had already gone dark, yet he still sat motionless, hands resting on the desk, staring into the void. Once after dinner, when Mrs. Lamb had gone to her room and Miss Lamb was out on the porch smoking, T letter 1B0, letter 1EDBC said very quiet, "When you live together for too long, both the parents and the children lose their freedom." He didn't say anything else. The words weren't harsh, they weren't accusatory, but they lodged in Dung's heart like a small pebble that snagged painfully every time she thought about it. And so Dung decided to buy her parents a house of their own. Not too far so she could visit often, but far enough so T letter 1B0 letter 1EDBC wouldn't feel that his in-laws had merely moved from his living room into another room, still firmly planted within his own life. House number 24 was close to the market, close to the church, close to the bus stop. The size was just right. It had a backyard, a balcony, a detached garage, and it was deeply discounted because the owner needed to sell in a hurry. Taan said the owner was Mr. TR letter 1B0 letter 1EDDNG, a journalist who translated news for the L letter 1EA1C H letter 1ED3NG newspaper, a widower living alone, currently in Canada visiting his younger brother, and wanting to sell the house so he could move back to Vietnam for good. Hearing this, Dung felt it was meant to be. The house wasn't new, but it was clean, tidy, and seemingly quiet, exactly the kind of place her parents would love. Thinking of the image of Mrs. Lamb walking to church every morning, Mr. Lamb sitting out on the balcony drinking tea, smoking, and reading the paper, with Kai the dog running around Mrs. Lamb's feet in the kitchen, Dung felt her heart soft. She told herself that perhaps everything would be fine. They just needed a space of their own. T letter 1B0, letter 1EDBC, just needed room to breathe. She just needed to stop splitting herself in half between being a daughter and being a wife every single day. She turned the engine back on just to play a CD. An old love song drifted out, the vocals thin and mournful, mingling with the soft patter of rain on the roof of the car. Dung reached out to turn the volume down, then instinctively let her gaze wander back to the house. From where she parked, the front window allowed her to see straight through the dining room and all the way into the kitchen at the back. There were no lights on inside, but a motion sensor light in the backyard had flickered to light. Its glow cast through the kitchen window, creating a pale, sickly white patch around the sink. And right there, inside that patch of light, Dung saw a woman standing. She froze. At first, she didn't have time to be afraid, because her brain was too busy denying what her eyes had just seen. The woman, or rather, a young girl, had a frail figure. She wore a white shirt, her hair falling loose down her back, standing at an angle before the sink. The light spilling in from the backyard only touched half of her face, making the exposed skin look unnaturally pale, not pale from makeup or from the glare of the bulb, but the ghastly white of something that had been submerged in cold water for a very long time. One of her hands rested near the edge of the sink, the fingers long, drooping downward, completely motionless. Her head was bowed slightly, as if she were staring down into the drain, or as if she were listening to the faint trickle of water that Dung could not hear. Dung sat paralyzed for a few seconds. She told herself that maybe Tan had arrived early. Maybe the owner had come back to grab some. Maybe someone was house-sitting. But the front door was still locked. The yard was empty. Tan's car wasn't here, and Tan had explicitly said the house had been vacant for over 4 months. She twisted around to the back seat, grabbed an old newspaper to shield her head, pushed the car door open, and dashed into the rain. The wind whipped water against her face, biting cold. She ran up the steps and rang the doorbell. 1, twice, 3 times. Chime echoed hollowly behind the heavy, closed door, then died, plunging into a suffocating silence. No footsteps. No voice asking who was there. Nothing. Dung pounded on the door harder. Is anyone in there? She twisted the doorknob, rattling it fiercely. Logged tight. She stepped down from the porch, walked over to the window, and pressed her face against the glass, peering directly at the spot where the girl had just stood. Inside, it was completely empty. The kitchen counter was bare. The sink was clean. A patch of light from the backyard still illuminated the space, but the girl in white had vanished as if she had never existed. Dung stumbled backward, her heels slipping on the wet steps, nearly sending her tumbling. She scrambled back to her car, threw herself inside, slammed the door shut, and pressed both hands to her chest, panting heavily. She stared fixedly at the kitchen window. No one. The rain fell in a steady drone. The willow tree in the yard swayed gently. She must have seen it wrong. The rain, the lights, the shadows of the trees, the wet glass, they all blurred together to form a human shape. When a person is stressed, their eyes are easily deceived. She had watched too many ghost movies. She had just scared herself. She thought that, but her hands were still trembling as she opened her purse to find her phone and call Tawan. It took a while for the other end to pick up. Tawan, are you almost here? I'm waiting out front. Yes, house number 24. Oh no. Before she could finish her sentence, her throat locked in ice. The girl in white had reappeared in the kitchen, in the exact same spot, still standing at an angle by the sink. Still the long hair, the white shirt, the deathly pale half-face. This time, Dung saw her more clearly because her eyes had adjusted to the dim light. She noticed the girl's shoulders were slightly slumped, like someone who was freezing cold or in deep pain. Her hair clung wetly to her cheeks. The hand resting on the edge of the sink didn't move, but the fingers looked macabrely long and frail. Dung, hello, are you still there? Taan's voice echoed through the phone. Dung opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She pushed the car door open and hurled herself into the rain a second time, running up the steps, pounding on the door with terrifying force, bordering on panic. Hey, you're in there, aren't you? Open the door. But when she looked through the window, the girl vanished. She didn't walk away. She didn't turn her back. She vanished from the patch of light, as if the darkness behind her had violently yanked her backward. The kitchen was empty again. Cold sink gleamed beneath the backyard light, looking exactly like a white eye staring out into the night. Right then, true terror finally flooded Dung's veins. It was no longer the mere startling of someone seeing a strange shadow. It was no longer the hesitation between illusion and reality. It was the sickening realization that the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. In the middle of a crowded city, on a street with houses, electricity, for sale, signs, neighbors, and a church just a short walk away, could there truly be a house where a dead person stood waiting in the kitchen? Dung raised her hand and made the sign of the cross. The movement came instinctively, rapidly, as if her body remembered her mother's words before her rational mind had the chance to mock. Ever since Dung was a little girl, Mrs. Lamb used to teach her, "We are children of faith, we don't fear ghosts and demons. God protects our bodies and our souls." Dung used to believe that phrase in the serene way of someone who had never been put in a position to test. She used to argue with T letter 1B0 letter 1EDBC that the ghosts in movies were just lingering souls of the dead based on folklore, fundamentally different from the demons in the Bible. She used to laugh when she heard her mother brush off any ghost story with a dismissive, "It's all nonsense." Yet now, sitting in her car in front of house number 24, Dung understood for the very first time that faith does not immediately banish human terror. It simply gives people something to cling to when the fear has already cut down to the bone. She got back into the car and lifted the phone to her ear. Tawan said he would be there in 5 or 10 minutes. The rain was heavy, so he didn't dare drive fast. Dung forced her voice to stay steady. Tawan, is there anyone else living in this house? You said it's been vacant for months, right? Tawan replied instantly. Yes, vacant for over 4 months. The owner is in Canada. I have the keys. Why do you ask? Dung stared dead at the kitchen. I just saw someone in there, a girl. The line went completely silent for a fraction of a sec. That's impossible, Dung. This is Mr. TR letter 1B0, letter 1EDD, NGS house. He's a widower, lives alone. There's absolutely no woman there. Besides, the doors are locked. I have the key. How could anyone get in? Maybe the owner came back to get something. Mr. TR letter 1B0, letter 1EDD, NG is really in Canada. He calls me every day to ask if I've sold it yet. He needs to sell it urgently to move back to Vietnam for good. The answer was too clear, too logical. But precisely because of that, it offered Dung no comfort at all. If there was no one in the house, then who had she just seen? When Tan arrived, he stepped out of his car holding a black umbrella, a hot cup of Starbucks coffee in his other hand. He had the slightly rushed but ever-polite demeanor of a real estate agent accustomed to dealing with all kinds of clients. Tan was an old classmate of T letter 1B0, letter 1EDBCS. He had been buying and selling houses for over 10 years, known for his honesty and charming way of speaking. He opened the door for Dung, slid the key into the lock, pushed the door open, and flicked on all the lights. Golden light flooded the living room, the dining table, the stairs, the kitchen, instantly making the house feel vastly more normal. The mahogany kitchen cabinets were still quite new. The floor was clean. The walls were painted a pale, soft color. The house carried a faint smell of age, the mustiness of being closed up for a long time, but it wasn't dirty. Dung stood by the dining table, pointing directly at the sink. I saw her standing right here. Thin white shirt, long hair, standing at an angle. Tan looked around, set his laptop and coffee down on the table, and said in a soothing voice, "It might be because of the rain. When people walk by on the street, or a car's headlights sweep past, the reflection on the glass can make you think there's someone inside. Empty houses are like that a lot. When you sit outside looking in, the tree shadows, the rain, the glass, everything just blends together." Dung wanted to believe, not because the explanation was truly convincing, but because it was the only bridge that could help her cross over the sheer absurdity of what had just happened. She nodded, forcing a tight smile. "Probably. I think it was just the rain, too." Tan led her upstairs to see the master bedroom. The room wasn't massive, but it felt cozy, featuring a door that opened out onto a balcony overlooking the backyard. A set of white plastic chairs was already placed out there. Tan opened the door, and the wind instantly whipped rain inside, forcing Dung to step back. The branches of the ancient maple tree drooped close to the railing, its leaves thoroughly soaked, shuddering in the wind. Tan said, "I like this spot the best." Mr. TR letter 1B0, letter 1EDD, and G told me he bought the house back then specifically because he loved sitting out on the balcony, reading the paper and drinking his coffee. It gets wonderfully cool in the summer. Dung looked at the white plastic chairs, thinking of Mr. Lamb. Her father would surely love coming out here to smoke, even though Mrs. Lamb would inevitably complain. That deeply ordinary image made her fear subside a little. They walked through the other rooms. The house was small, so it only took 10 minutes to view everything. Once they were back downstairs at the dining table, Tan opened his laptop and started talking about the price, the new plaza about to open, the Saigon supermarket opening a branch nearby, the potential for property value to rise. Dung sat and listened, trying her best to focus, but her eyes, every now and then, would instinctively search for the kitchen window. And then the girl in white reappeared. This time, she wasn't inside the house. She stood in the backyard, just on the other side of the kitchen window, staring straight at Dung through the rain-streaked glass. Because the lights in the kitchen were brighter than the ones outside, Dung couldn't see her face clearly. She only saw the frail silhouette, the white shirt blurring in the curtain of rain, the long hair hanging down, her entire body paralyzed beneath the down. The ring of keys in Dung's hand clattered to the floor. She shot up from her chair, pointing wildly at the window, her mouth barely able to form coherent words. "There, do you see her?" Tan spun around, No one. Dung grabbed his arm and dragged him right up to the kitchen counter. The girl had vanished before they even got close. Outside in the yard, there was only the rain, the swaying maple tree, the tightly sealed garage, the dark and damp fence. "Person can't move that fast," Dung whispered, her voice so small it sounded foreign even to herself. Tawan scanned the yard, then forced a laugh. In this kind of storm, who'd be crazy enough to stand out there? Dung said, "When I was outside, she stood inside the kitchen. The moment I come inside, she stands out in the yard." Tawan went quiet for a moment before saying, "You're making it sound like a ghost story." "I know." Dung looked at him, "But I really saw it." Reluctantly, Tan unlocked the back door, flipped on all the yard lights, grabbed his umbrella, and stepped out to investigate. The wind hurled cold rain against the doorframe, freezing to the bone. He opened the garage using the remote, the lights inside flickering to light. Empty. There was nothing inside except a few wooden shelves. Behind the garage sat a small storage shed built against the fence, padlocked from the outside. Tan said he had the key to that as well. He would open it for her to see on a sunnier day. Standing in the doorway, looking out at the yard, Dung realized something strange. The yard wasn't very big, the fence was high, the garage was locked, the shed was locked, and the narrow walkways on both sides of the house were completely bare. If a girl had truly been standing right outside the window, where could she possibly hide in a matter of seconds? But there was no place to lay that question down. Tan walked back, shook off his umbrella, turned off the yard lights and shut the door. They returned to the dining table. Tan asked if Dung had decided to sign the offer yet. Dung looked at the kitchen one last time. Inside her at that moment, there were two voices. One told her to walk away. The other told her not to be stupid. It was a good house. Her parents would love it, and she shouldn't let a hallucination ruin something so important. In the end, the second voice won. Dung told him to give her until tomorrow. She would bring her parents to see the outside, and if they liked it, she would sign immediately. When they left the house, Tan held his umbrella over Dung, walking her to her car. The rain was still falling steadily. Dung got in, started the engine, and purely out of habit, looked at the kitchen window one final time. No one was there, but in her rearview mirror, she saw a man in a black raincoat standing across the street under a tree, wearing a hat, staring motionlessly at the house. She jolted, twisting her head all the way around to look. The man was trudging away through the rain, very slowly, as if he was in absolutely no rush to escape the downpour, before gradually dissolving into the dark space between two rows of trees. On the drive home, the image of the girl in white and the man in black clung to her violently. Dung promised herself she wouldn't tell anyone. She wouldn't tell T letter 1B0, letter 1EDBC, because he would just say she watched too many horror movies. She wouldn't tell her mother because she would wave it away with "Children of faith have nothing to fear." She wouldn't tell her father because he would be half skeptical, half worried. But the more she kept it to herself, the deeper it lodged inside her, like a drop of freezing water falling onto her chest that refused to melt away. The next afternoon, the sun blazed brilliant. Under the daylight, house number 24 looked so completely ordinary that Dung felt embarrassed by her terror the night before. The willow tree in the yard was graceful. The maple tree in the back was just a maple tree. The kitchen door was bright and inviting. The grass was deeply green, and the garage was neatly kept. "Mr. and Mrs. Lamb walked around, their faces radiant with joy. Mrs. Lamb praised the house for being near the church, near the market, with a bus stop right down the street. Mr. Lamb stood beneath the balcony, looked up, and smiled, saying it would feel amazing to step out there for an early morning smoke. Mrs. Lamb immediately scolded him with deep affection. "Cigarettes again. You're in America now, enough with the cigarettes." Watching her parents, Dung's heart melted. She saw no girl in white. She saw no man in black. She saw absolutely no sign of anything anomalous. It was as if the sunlight had scoured it all clean. When Mrs. Lamb urged her to secure the house right away, Dung called Tan over to sign the paper. The paperwork was handled swiftly. Mr. Tr letter 1B0, letter 1EDD, NG in Canada, agreed to fly back to finalize the deed. 1 week later, Mr. and Mrs. Lamb moved into house number 24. T letter 1B0 letter 1EDBC took a full day off work to help move their belongings, carrying the bed, the tables, the wardrobe, the boxes of dishes, the holy pictures, Mr. Lamb's teapot set, the bags of clothes, and the few small potted plants Mrs. Lamb had brought over from Dung's house, alongside 2 of his friends. The empty house quickly filled with the warmth of human life. From the kitchen came the clatter of Mrs. Lamb stacking bowls. Out on the balcony sat Mr. Lamb's ashtray. A crucifix hung in the living room. Their slippers rested by the door. By nightfall, when everything was more or less settled, Mrs. Lamb reminded Dung to bring Kai the dog over the next day. The house was quiet, and having a dog would liven things up. Dung agreed, hugged her mother, said goodbye to her father, and headed out to her car. As she backed out of the driveway, she saw the man in black standing across the street again, beneath the exact same tree. It wasn't raining this time. His black coat melted into the shadows, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, his posture rigid and motionless. Dung slammed on the brakes and stared. The figure turned his back, walked away slowly, and vanished into the shadows of the trees. Her heart seized with a sharp ache, but she drove home anyway. There are mistakes that happen not because people miss the warning sign. They happen because people see them, but desperately need to believe they saw them wrong. The first night Mr. and Mrs. Lamb slept in their new home, the one who suffered from insomnia was Dung. The drizzle outside was identical to the night she first went to see the house. Dung lay beside T letter 1B0 letter 1EDBC, listening to the rain tap against the window, her eyes wide open in the dark. Her phone sat on the nightstand. Every few minutes she glanced at it. If her parents ran into trouble, they would call. If they didn't call, it meant everything was fine. T letter 1B0 letter 1EDBC was fast asleep, his breathing steady. Dung lay there, waiting for a phone call that never came. By 3 in the morning, the phone was still silent. She let out a breath of relief, scolding herself for worrying too much. An empty house in the rain was bound to play tricks on her imagination. The white silhouette was just a hallucination. The man in black was probably just a neighbor out for a walk. Convinced, Dung finally drifted off. Late the next morning, she drove over to house number 24. Mrs. Lamb was wiping down the kitchen counter, and Mr. Lamb was sitting out on the balcony reading the newspaper and drinking tea, both of them looking vibrant and refreshed. Mrs. Lamb laughed, saying she had slept like the dead, though Miss Lamb had gotten up to smoke on the balcony 5 or 7 times. Mr. Lamb, for his part, praised the house for being peaceful, scenic, and pleasantly isolated from the neighbor. A massive weight lifted off Dung's chest. A single normal night is sometimes powerful enough to defeat seeing a ghost 3 times. But the house was only waiting for the second night. Nearing midnight, Mr. Lamb had just dozed off when his eyes snapped open in a panic. He lay perfectly still, tilting his head to listen. Wafting up from the kitchen below was the sound of running water, faint, but steady and undeniably real. Mingled with it was the clinking of bowls and plates, as if someone were washing them, setting them one by one into the drying rack. During the day, such a sound would be entirely ordinary, but in the middle of a sleeping house, it made his heart race. Mrs. Lamb had gone up to the bedroom at the same time he did. Why would she be down in the kitchen at this hour? He opened the bedroom door and looked down the stairs. The ground floor was pitch black. Not a single light was on. The water was still running. He went to his wife's room and pushed the door ajar. Mrs. Lamb was lying on the bed, the blanket pulled up to her chest, fast asleep. So who was down in the kitchen? He closed the door, returned to his room, climbed into bed, and pulled the covers tightly over himself like a frightened child. He told himself he must have heard wrong, that perhaps the pipes in the old house were groaning, that perhaps old age was playing tricks on his ears. A moment later, the water stopped. The house fell silent. He was just lulling himself back to sleep when a scratching sound erupted from the kitchen window downstairs. That's great, like sharp fingernails scraping violently against glass. Sometimes slow, sometimes frantic, sometimes drawn out so long it set his teeth on edge. He shot upright. Cold sweat beaded at the nape of his neck. He thought of a stray dog wandering into the yard and pawing at the door. That thought gave him a shred of courage. He turned on the lights, opened the balcony door, and looked down at the backyard. The moonlight was obscured by the maple canopy. The yard was a bruised, shadowy blue. The scratching stopped the exact second he stepped outside. No dog, no person. He stood there staring for a long time before turning back inside. The moment he pulled the door shut, the scratching started again. This time more irritated than terrified, he threw the door open and rushed out. Dead silent. The yard was still empty. He was about to turn back when he saw the silhouette of a girl wearing a white shirt walking briskly along the side of the garage, heading toward the fence at the very back of the garden, before completely vanishing. She didn't climb the fence. She didn't open the shed door. She simply vanished. He staggered back, collapsing into the balcony chair, his face entirely drained of blood. Suddenly, a cold hand slapped down hard on his shoulder. He screamed. But it was Mrs. Lamb, awakened by the commotion. She started scolding him for sneaking out to smoke in the middle of the night, but when she saw the sheer terror on his face, her voice faded into silence. He told her everything: the water, the clinking dishes, the scratching, the girl in white. Mrs. Lamb didn't believe. She dragged him downstairs to check. They flipped on every single light. The kitchen was spotless. The faucet was bone dry. The garage was locked. The shed was locked. The fence was high, and the sandy soil beneath it bore no footprints. She was just about to tell her husband he was seeing things when she looked up at the kitchen window. The girl in white stood inside, right in front of the sink. She looked young, her hair long, her face blurred behind a layer of heavy condensation, and a chaotic web of scratch marks on the glass. Mrs. Lamb let out a shriek, digging her nails into her husband's arm. Mr. Lamb saw her too, but he was too paralyzed by terror to speak. The girl vanished right before their eyes. When the elderly couple retreated upstairs, Mrs. Lamb turned to close the balcony door, only to catch a fleeting glimpse of the girl's shadow at the far end of the yard, slipping right into the door of the storage shed behind the garage. This time, she collapsed to her knees. "This house really has ghosts, old man," she gasped, entirely out of breath. That night, they didn't dare turn off the lights. Two of them knelt and recited prayers for nearly half an hour, the rosary beads trembling violently in their hands. Mrs. Lamb begged God for protection, praying that if it was a lost soul, he would grant it passage and ask it never to return. But their prayers, no matter how devout, did not make the house any warmer. They only made the silence around them feel as if it were listening far more intently. Near dawn, a violent gust of wind slammed the balcony door open against the wall. Mr. Lamb jolted awake, his very first instinct to reach for the blanket because he was freezing. It was impossibly cold. Not the chill of the night air, but a biting cold that crawled from the floorboards up his spine, seeping through his ribs, gnawing at his bare feet. He groped around, but beneath his hands there was no mattress, no bedsheets, only rough wooden planks caked in damp dust. The stench of rotting earth flooded his nose, mixed with the smell of decaying wood, dead rats, and a faint, stale, metallic reek, like wet clothes locked in a dark corner for far too long. He opened his eyes. Above him there was no bedroom ceiling, no soft glow of a lamp, no wooden crucifix hanging on the wall. There was only a suffocating, pitch-black darkness pressing flush against his face, so thick he felt that if he opened his mouth, it would pour straight down his throat. For the first few seconds, he couldn't comprehend where he was. Then a rustling sound echoed from the corner of the room, very soft, like a hand dragging itself across the wooden floor. He held his breath. His heart hammered so violently, his entire ribcage shuddered. In the pitch black, he knew with absolute certainty he was not alone. Something was in there, incredibly close, also remaining perfectly silent, also listening to the ragged rhythm of his breathing. He propped himself up on his elbows. Something dry and brittle brushed against the back of his hand. He flinched violently, swatting it away, hearing whatever it was rattle across the darkness. A singular thought flashed through his mind. bone. The realization turned his blood to ice. He opened his mouth to scream for Mrs. Lamb, but at first no sound came out, only a hoarse, broken gasp. When it finally dawned on him that he was not in his bed, but locked inside the storage shed behind the garage, the exact place Mrs. Lamb had seen the white shadow vanish into, utter, primal terror ripped his throat wide open. He screamed, "Wife, help me! Is anyone there? Help me!" His voice battered against the walls of the shed and bounced back distorted, as if a dozen other people were screaming for their lives alongside him in the dark. He scrambled toward the thin slit of light beneath the door, tearing at the floorboards with his bare hands, his knees cracking painfully against something hard. Behind him, the rustling sound echoed again. Closer, as if someone had just hitched themselves forward. Mrs. Lamb woke to the screaming. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but the frantic, desperate pounding against the shed door echoed up from the backyard. She hurled herself down the stairs, nearly tripping, screaming her husband's name as she ran. The neighbors next door were roused by the noise as well. When they finally managed to break open the shed and drag Mr. Lamb out, he collapsed onto the concrete, his face deathly white, his lips bruised purple. His hair and clothes were coated in thick grime, his hands scraped and bleeding. He clung to his wife's arm, shaking so violently he couldn't stand. A flashlight swept the inside of the shed. Nothing but empty wooden shelves, rotting cardboard boxes, an old tarp, and an impossibly thick layer of dust. No one saw another soul. But on the floor, near the darkest corner, there was a faint drag mark, as if someone had just hauled a heavy object across the boards. Mr. Lamb kept repeating over and over, "I didn't walk out here. Someone is in there. Someone was lying right next to me." That morning, Dung rushed over, only to find that her parents had visibly aged a decade in a single night. Mrs. Lamb looked at her daughter, her voice ragged. "Dung, you bought us a haunted house." Dung didn't question it. She only felt the crushing weight of guilt drop onto her chest, suffocating her. She had seen it first. She had seen the girl 3 times. She had seen the man in black. She could have stopped this, but she didn't stop, because she desperately needed this house to fix the lives of the living. And now, a dead person was demanding her space back from within it. Tyan was called over. Color drained from his face as he listened to the story, but he still tried to rationalize it. Maybe Mr. Lamb was sleepwalking. Maybe the shed hadn't been locked properly. Maybe the elderly couple was just stressed. The more he said maybe, the weaker his excuses sounded. Letter 1B0, letter 1EDB-C arrived as well. He had never believed in ghosts, but on his way to house number 24, on a desolate stretch of road between 2 rows of trees, a girl in a white shirt suddenly stepped right out in front of his car. Letter 1B0, letter 1EDB-C slammed on the brakes. The girl leaned down to the window, her voice impossibly small and freezing. "Give me a ride." Letter 1B0, letter 1EDB-C was about to refuse, but before he could even form the words, she opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. He couldn't remember when he had unlocked the doors. The car crawled forward. He asked her where she was heading. She stared straight ahead. Number 24. A chill crawled up letter 1B0, letter 1EDB-C's spine. "You live there. I'm so cold. Where did you come from?" "Down there." "Down where?" She turned to him. Chalk-white skin, purple lips, hollowed eyes, a bruised black ring around her neck like the imprint of human hands. "Under the shed." The car pulled up in front of the house. Letter 1B0, letter 1EDB-C whipped his head toward the passenger seat. Empty. The door was still shut tight. The seat wasn't wet. There was only the stench of damp earth and hair that had been wet for a very, very long time. That night, letter 1B0, letter 1EDB-C and Tan stayed at the house. Mr. and Mrs. Lamb temporarily returned to Dung's place. 2 men turned on every light and sat at the dining table with coffee, flashlights, and their phones. Letter 1B0, letter 1EDB-C interrogated him about Mr. Letter 1B0, letter 1EDD-NG. Tan insisted he was a widower, living alone. Letter 1B0, letter 1 EDBC at. Was there ever a woman living here? Tawan stayed quiet for longer than necessary. Finally, he admitted that neighbors had once mentioned a Vietnamese girl named Mai who had lived in the small annex behind the garage, perhaps a maid or a short-term tenant who had later returned to Vietnam, according to Miss TR letter 1B0, letter 1EDDNG. The name Mai dropped the temperature in the kitchen. Nearing midnight, the sound of running water erupted again, despite the faucet being firmly shut. Then the plates and bowls inside the cupboards began to clink together. When Tyan threw the cabinet open, the dishes were perfectly still, yet the noise instantly shifted to directly behind them. On the glass of the kitchen window, white scratch marks manifested out of thin air, long, jagged, crisscrossing furiously, accompanied by a screeching sound that rattled their teeth. The two men bolted into the backyard. No one. When they looked back into the kitchen through the window, the girl in white was standing inside, right in front of the sink. This time, both of them saw her. T letter 1B0, letter 1EDBC charged back into the house, but by the time he reached the kitchen, she had vanished. On the edge of the sink, a long trail of water dripped down onto the floor. He touched it. It was freezing cold. Nearing 3 in the morning, a knocking sound echoed from the storage shed behind the garage. 3 bites. Thud, thud, thud. Then silent. 3 bites again. Thud, thud, thud. Tawan shook his head, his face completely pale. We're not going out there. T letter 1B0, letter 1EDB. C gripped his flashlight. Do you have the key? Tawan swallowed hard. Yes, open it. The two men crossed the backyard. The wind tore through the maple tree, the rustling leaves sounding like hundreds of people whispering at once. Across the fence, standing far away in the shadows of the trees, the man in black stood watching them. When T letter 1B0, letter 1EDBC flashed the light in his direction, the shadow retreated and dissolved. Tawan jammed the key into the padlock, his hands shaking so violently the metal clattered against metal. The door cranked open. A wave of musty air hit them first, followed by a heavier, sickeningly sweet, putrid stench of something locked away for a very long time. The flashlight beam swept past the wooden shelves, the rotting cardboard boxes, the old tarp, before stopping dead at the farthest corner. Beneath the floorboards, there was an unnatural, swollen bulge. The knocking echoed again, not from the door, from beneath the floor. Thud, thud, thud. T letter 1B0, letter 1EDBC took a crowbar and pried the floorboards up. The rotted wood snapped. The stench of decay exploded upward, choking them like a black hand gripping their throats. In a shallow hollow beneath the dirt lay a curled, skeletal corpse. Shreds of rotting white fabric still clung to the bone. Long hair was matted into clumps, and a rusted metal bangle encircled one wrist. Beside it sat a degraded plastic bag containing a few moldy documents, a water-ruined photograph, and a scrap of paper bearing a name. Mai. Tawan violently wretched onto the floor. T letter 1B0, letter 1EDB, C sat paralyzed in a dead silence. From the kitchen, the sound of running water began to flow again, but this time, it sounded as if someone was finally washing their hands clean after years of being stained with blood. Truth didn't reveal itself in one clear, cohesive explanation, but in freezing, shattered fragments. Mr. TR letter 1B0, letter 1EDDNG, the former owner, a widower living alone. Mai, a young girl who came over from Vietnam, who lived in the annex behind the garage, doing odd jobs, who disappeared without a trace because she had no real family here to look. The man in black could have been Mr. TR letter 1B0, letter 1EDDNG when he was still alive, wandering in the shadow of his own guilt, or perhaps it was a different phantom the house kept around to guard its secrets. No one knew for sure. The only absolute certainty was that a dead girl had lain beneath the floorboards of the shed for years, and for all those years, she had stood in the kitchen, scratched at the window glass, turned on the water, and summoned the living to the exact spot where she had been hid. Dung wept when she learned her name was Mai. She didn't cry loudly. The tears just cascaded down in a desperate, suffocating silence. She thought of the girl who had stood at the sink 3 times, stood in the backyard, flagged down T letter 1B0 letter 1EDBCS car for a ride, and led Miss Lamb into the shed. She hadn't harmed anyone. She only wanted to be found. But once she was found, the living immediately began conspiring on how to handle it with the least amount of inconvenience. Calling the police meant the house would become a murder scene, an agonizing legal process. Mr. TR letter 1B0 letter 1EDD NG would be dragged back. The press, the forensics, the massive financial loss, the scandal. Tawan would lose his career. Mr. and Mrs. Lamb would lose their home. Dung would have to face T letter 1B0 letter 1EDBC, and worse, face herself. The initial righteousness within them was slowly, systematically suffocated by the brutal realities of their own lives. Ultimately, they didn't call the police right away. They set up a small altar inside the shed. T letter 1B0, letter 1EDBC lit incense, calling out Mai's name in a hoarse voice. Dung laid down a bouquet of white flowers. Tawan stood in the back, his head bowed. They consoled themselves by thinking that at least her name had been spoken. At least she had incense. At least she was no longer entirely forgotten. But deep down, Dung knew with agonizing clarity, this was simply the way the living pacified their consciences when they lacked the courage to fully repay their debts to the dead. 1 month later, Taan sold house number 24 to an American family and found a different place for Mr. and Mrs. Lamb. Everyone desperately tried to treat the story as a nightmare they had finally woken up, but house number 24 did not let anyone forget so easily. The American family moved in on a bright, sunny morning. Tall father, a blonde mother, a 10-year-old boy, and a 6-year-old girl clutching a rag doll. They laughed and talked in the yard, hung up new curtains, placed potted flowers on the porch, changed the locks, and blasted music while unpacking. For a few hours, the house felt as if it had truly been resurrected. But on the very first night, the little girl told her mother there was a wet lady standing in the kitchen, wearing a soaked white shirt, her hair covering her face, asking the little girl if she was cold. The mother assumed her daughter was just exhausted from the move, hugged her, and coaxed her to sleep. On the second night, the father heard water running down in the kitchen. He went to check, only to find that every single bowl and plate from the cupboards had been taken out, washed immaculately, and stacked in perfect order on the counter, dripping wet as if they had just been plunged into a bucket of ice water. He spun around to call his wife, only to see his son standing at the foot of the stairs, face pale as a sheet, pointing a trembling finger at the kitchen window. The glass was entirely covered in fresh, chaotic, blindingly white scratch marks, even though there was absolutely no one outside. On the third night, the little girl woke up at 3 in the morning and walked barefoot down the stairs. Her older brother woke up, followed her, and found his sister standing right in front of the storage shed behind the garage. She had one hand resting on the padlock, her mouth repeating in a flat, dead monotone, "She wants her name back." The father sprinted out and scooped his daughter up into his arm. Her skin was freezing to the touch, the hair at the nape of her neck soaked, as if she had just been standing out in the rain. At that exact moment, a deafening crash erupted from the kitchen as plates and bowls shattered across the floor. The mother screamed. When the entire family rushed in, they saw the girl in the white shirt standing right outside the kitchen window, her forehead nearly pressed against the glass. This time her face was terrifyingly clear beneath the lights. Chalk-white, hollow eyes, purple lips, a bruised black ring around her neck, and a mouth that opened and closed without making a sound. The little girl shrieked until her face turned purple. The father did not wait a single second longer. He dragged his wife and children to the car that very night, abandoning their furniture, their coats, and even the little girl's rag doll, which lay abandoned on the stairs, its painted face staring directly into the kitchen. The next morning, Tyan received a phone call. The American man spoke in a hoarse, fractured voice. "Zealot, we are not going back inside." When Tyan arrived, the house was still packed with their belongings. The milk in the fridge was still open. A box of cereal was spilled across the table. A child's shoe lay in the hallway. On the small whiteboard attached to the fridge, where the family used to write their to-do lists, one single word was written in a dark, rusty, blood-red color. May I? Talon stood staring at it for a very long time. He didn't touch it. He didn't wipe it away. He simply closed the door, walked out into the yard, and for the first time in his entire real estate career, he did not immediately put up a for sale sign. He sat in his car for hours, staring at house number 24 through the windshield, feeling an overwhelming certainty that behind those dark windows, a young woman was standing there, wait. She wasn't waiting for a buyer. She was waiting for the living to finally tell the truth. Rumors spread faster than any contract ever could. People started calling it the haunted house. The for sale sign was eventually hung back up, but it only grew more faded with time. The grass grew high. The willow tree continued to weep its hair down over the walkway. The maple tree in the back still spread its canopy, hugging the roof like two blackened arms. No one dared to live there. No one wanted to buy it. Passers-by whispered that sometimes they saw a girl in a white shirt standing at the sink, her head bowed, her hair falling loose. Some claimed they saw her standing in the backyard, right by the door to the shed, her hand resting against the glass, as if she wanted to scratch it but no longer had the strength. Others swore they saw a man in a black coat standing across the street beneath the tree, staring motionlessly into the house, as if standing guard, as if waiting, as if forbidden to ever leave. Many years later, Dung would still occasionally drive past that neighborhood, but she never once turned down that street. Every time she passed, she would instinctively slow down without even realizing it. Letter 1B0, letter 1EDBC, stopped watching horror movies entirely. Mr. Lamb gave up cigarettes, not for his health, but because every time he smelled tobacco smoke, he was violently transported back to the suffocating stench of damp earth in that pitch-black shed. Mrs. Lamb still prayed the rosary every night, but her prayers now included a quiet, fragile addition, asking God to have mercy on the forgotten souls. Tyan stayed in real estate, still drinking his coffee before showing houses to clients, but before he signed off on any paperwork, he always stared agonizingly long at the address, terrified that somewhere within those profoundly ordinary numbers, a knocking sound would echo up from beneath the floorboard. House number 24 remains abandoned. When it rains, the kitchen windows blur with water. At night, the sickly yellow street lamp in the yard occasionally flickers on and off, though no one ever repairs it. No one knows if Mai has finally crossed over or not. Perhaps not. Perhaps the unjustly dead do not need the living to believe in them. They only need the living to never forget. Perhaps she doesn't return to terrify anyone, but to ask one incredibly simple question. If you saw me, why did you still walk away? And that question is what has haunted the house the longest. It isn't the sound of running water at midnight. It isn't the scratch marks on the glass. It isn't the white silhouette in the kitchen. It is the crushing silence of the people who knew exactly where a dead girl lay buried beneath the floorboards, who lit a few sticks of incense for her, who called her name a handful of times, and then sold the house away as if they could simply hand off their own sins to someone else. From then on, whenever the drizzle drags out into the evening, the people living near that street always pull their curtains shut very early. Because if they leave their windows open for too long, sometimes, cutting through the sound of the rain and the wind in the trees, they will hear a girl's voice, impossibly small, impossibly cold, echoing out from house number 24. Let me in. I'm so cold.